All right, thanks everybody for joining. I hope we're looking forward to this session. This is actually a session that is taken a little bit from a class that we brought in Pragmatic Works. We're in a class called a Reporting Services Master's class where we cover a lot of performance tuning techniques for reports, and this is kind of an excerpt of that, as well as some additional content as well. My name is Devin Knight. You can see my contact information on the screen now, and as well as my Twitter. If you do Twitter, that's there as well. Tweet quite a bit about BI and reporting services and anything BI related. So again, our focus of this session is performance tuning reporting services reports. We're focusing in more on what you can do on the report server, not so much what you would do in a query. So I'm assuming once you get into performance tuning a report, you've done all you can to performance tune the query. You've used execution plans to try and troubleshoot query problems, and you're still seeing just a slow loading report. And we're going to talk about some of the things in this session that you can do to alleviate that. So again, a little bit about myself. I'm the training director at Pragmatic Works. So anything having to do with training, I'm usually involved with at some point. I'm SQL Server MVP. I was awarded that in just this recent October. I've written 5 SQL Server books. And I run a local user group here, the Jacksonville SQL Server User Group. I also blog at a website called bidn.com. That's a Business Intelligence Development Network. All right, so our plan for today, though, is what we're going to do is look at how we can monitor performance of a report server. We're also going to talk about how we can use report caching to try and troubleshoot problems or really try and improve performance of our reports, even with poor performing queries that we can't get around. And we're also going to talk about automating report caching. So how can we actually use report caching to automate the pre-caching of a report? So that way when someone comes in the morning, they're automatically going to get a report result set that's already been cached and ready to go for them. And if we have time, that last section there, verify report cache, is actually being used. If we have some extra time, which I have a feeling we got enough content here to take up an hour and maybe an hour and a half, if we have some extra time, we'll talk about verifying that the report cache is actually being used whenever your reports are being run. All right, so let's first talk about monitoring your report performance. My suggestion for this, to be able to monitor the performance of your reports, is to create essentially like a monitoring database or a data mart on top of your report server. Okay, so let me whiteboard the concept of this here real quickly before we go too much in depth on the slide here. So you have, if you're not aware, I'll make you aware, you have a report server database. I'm sure many of you are already aware of that. That report server database stores all the metadata for your reports. So it has metadata about the XML of the reports, how the reports are laid out, has connection information. It also has report executions. So it actually stores executions for my reports inside that report server database. And it's great that it does that because you can actually use that data to be able to see, is my report running slower today than it did last week? Or is it running slower this month than it did last year? So I can actually do some comparisons on my report to see, am I meeting my expectations? Who is actually running the most of my reports? And there's a lot of good information in there. However, the downside of the report server database is it only stores this report execution information for a limited amount of time, and that just depends on how active your report server is. Generally, it's somewhere around 3 months. And after 3 months, that report execution data, this is just the execution of your reports, is kind of phased out. So after every 3 months, your data kind of rolls off, and you just keep the most recent 3 months. Again, 3 months, it just depends on how much use you get out of your report server, but that's about how often it keeps that data. So it keeps this great data, but only keeps it for so long. So what we're talking about in this first slide is the concept of creating a little data mart on top of your report server database. So rather than having to rely on just 3 months worth of data, I want to be able to compare data across an entire year or multiple years and see, does this report run faster now than it did 1 year ago, or vice versa. I also want to be able to see who's running the most of my reports and what kind of parameters they're using whenever they're running reports. So the concept here is a report monitoring database, and I actually call it here a RS execution log database. Okay, by the way, if you're seeing a white screen right now, I see someone said that their screen froze. You can usually just log back out and log back in and it comes back, but you should be seeing a whiteboard right now. But the concept here is to create this report execution log database, and it's essentially like a little data mart. It's So if you've done any kind of data warehousing, this is kind of like a data mart that will store my report executions. I'm going to take the portion of this report server database that I care about, and I'm going to pull this into my report server execution log. This way I can have all this information, and not only will I have it for the last 3 months, but I can keep a history of it in this RS execution log database. So I can keep a history of all my report executions, and I can really see how the performance for my reports run now versus how they ran last year. Now, to do this, there's actually a Codeplex project. I'll show you how to get to that here in a few moments, but there's a Codeplex project that has all of the required elements to do this. It has a script to create the database. So first of all, you need a script to create the database, that database being the RS execution log database. You also need it comes with an SSIS package to load said database. And then finally it comes with a set of reports to show you the information that's in that database. So reports to view execution data. Okay, so this way I can query against that report server database, pull that information into my RS execution log database. So this right here represents SSIS. That line represents an SSIS package pulling that information into the RS execution log database. I can schedule that to run nightly, that sort of thing. And then I can place these reports that I'm going to show you how to get these reports. It actually comes along with a project I'm going to show you. But I can use these reports to be able to view how fast or how slow my reports are running. Okay? And I can also see who's running my reports and also see which parameters they're using. So this is kind of the concept here. Now I demonstrate this in the slide here as well. You can create a data mart, and you could query directly against the report server database. But I just mentioned the flaw with that. You're only going to get about 3 months worth of executions. Now the other reason you may create this data mart is you're going to be able to easily create and pull together these tables in an easy to report on format. So you can use the reports that I'm going to show you, or you can actually create your own, because it's basically in a data mart that's easy to report on. And like I mentioned, it does come with some usage reports, so you can see things like the longest running reports, report parameters that are being used, and there's actually quite a few other reports that are available there as well. Okay. All right, so let's show you what this looks like. I'm going to show you what the monitoring reports look like, and then I'll tell you where you can get this project. It's a Codeplex project that you can get. All right, so what I'm showing right here on my screen is a report execution summary. I did not create this report. I actually got it from an open source project, and I just upgraded it to work for SQL Server 2012. I think it's actually supported for 2005 and up. But what I can see in this little dashboard, first of all, it has a parameter set here where I can see my start date and end date. I can see the execution summaries, and I can see how many total executions I've had, how many by day, how many total successes, how many total failures I've had. I can even come down and see my executions by month. Now obviously this is on my laptop, so there's not a whole lot of executions on my laptop, but I can see how many executions there were by month, how many by day of week, what were the top 10 executed reports. I can see here. You'll see there's one blank here. That usually indicates a report that got deleted. I could also click on these. So if I wanted to click on any one of these reports, like this power user report here, I could click on that one. And it'll take me to a report summary where it'll show me all of the executions. It'll also show me which parameters were being used and which values were being used in each of the parameters when they were run. So I can go underneath this lag month parameter and see that the value of 12 was run 66 times and the value of 6 was run 5 times. I can drill under any one of these different parameter values and see, okay, looks like internet sales amount was my parameter 71 of 71 times here. So very interesting that you could use this and be able to get into more detail. Now, how can this be used for performance? Well, if I take a step back and scroll a little bit further down, I'll see the longest running reports. So which of my reports are taking the longest to run? Right now, this one here called Module 5 has 11 executions at 9 seconds, so obviously that's not too bad. But if I have an SLA that says I have to have reports returned back in 3 seconds, then obviously here I have some work to do, and this shows me which reports are the ones I need to attack first. Okay? There are also some more details in here, like the largest reports, and one of my favorite portions of this report is the top 10 users. So I can kind of prioritize my users. If I see a user is complaining about reports and they have 5,000 executions compared to the next closest person that has 400 executions, well, then I probably want to help out the person that has 5,000 executions versus the 100 executions. So I can kind of prioritize my requests to help people based on their usage. Now, this is all nice. This is good stuff that you can get. Now, let me show you where I got this from, because, again, I didn't come up with this. This is an open source project that allows you to keep more than that, a limited amount of data, and it also is going to allow you to keep things like the users that were running and how long the reports took to run. Now, this can be found on codeplex.com. It's a source for a lot of open source information. If you just go to codeplex.com, and you'll just do a basic search in the very top right for reporting services. Okay, if you search for reporting services in the top right, one of your first elements that you'll find here is a Microsoft SQL Server product sample for reporting services. You'll go ahead and open that up. And you'll see there's a set of reports in here. There's some sample reports that give you some examples of what reporting services can do some AdventureWorks samples. But you'll also find a set of reports here called Server Management Sample Reports. These reports you can use to do exactly what I showed. Not only in that project that you'll download does it have reports, it also has an SSIS package as well as a database to be able to create for you. So it gives you everything you need to be able to create that solution. Now, you'll notice here in the little columns that it only has it for SQL Server 2005 and 2008. If you're using 2012 or 2008 R2, simply download the 2008 one and upgrade the project. So if you just open the 2008 project in your version of Visual Studio or SQL Server Data Tools, it'll automatically upgrade it for you. Okay? And this is what I use to be able to get all that great stats about how my report server is running and the performance of my report server, and really individual reports. Okay? All right. So codeplex.com and do a quick search for reporting services. All right. Let's now talk about report caching. So let's say we've determined that we found a report that we want to performance tune. We found a report. It takes 10 seconds to run, and I have an SLA of 3 seconds. So I need to get this report to run faster. One way I can do that is through a method called report caching. And this is kind of why I had Rachel put in that poll question earlier, so I can see how many of you have actually done caching before. And that was about, if I remember right, about 40% of you have done it at least once, I'm assuming. So this will be new for a lot of you. So what report caching is going to do for us is it's going to store a temporary copy of a report in the report server tempdb. So I mentioned earlier you have a report server database. You also have a report server tempdb. And that report server tempdb is often used for storing report executions or just doing the processing of report executions. But it also is used for report caching. Now I'm going to whiteboard this as well because this is a key concept to get down. Let's whiteboard how caching works. Okay, so let's say I have a report. Okay, so this is my report. And I have two people that work in my organization. I'm going to do a very poor attempt here at drawing out a person. You can laugh at me later. I'm not even going to go beyond their head. I'm just going to say they are floating heads here. All right, so I have, it's codeplex.com, by the way. Someone asked what the website was again, codeplex.com. So here's my scenario. I have two people. This is, I'll give very generic names. This is Jill, and this is Jeff. Okay? All right, so Jill comes in every morning to work at about 8 a.m. She's usually right on time, 8 a.m. every day. Okay, she comes in to work at 8 a.m. and the first thing she does when she gets into the office is she runs this report because this tells her really what she needs to do to start off her day. Okay, so if she runs this report, she knows exactly what the next hour and a half for her work is going to look like. Jeff, however, he comes in a little bit later. He's a little bit of a slacker. He comes in at 8:30, but he basically has the same role, and he has to run the exact same report. Okay, so they're both running the exact same report. They're both getting the same information back. Okay. Now, what I'd like to do, again, remember this report takes about 9 or 10 seconds to run. What I'd like to do is make it so that Jill doesn't have to wait, or really even either one of these people. I don't want them to have to wait for a report to execute. I want it to be able to come back immediately and them to see results. Okay? So maybe this is even worse than 9 seconds. Maybe this takes 30 seconds, and they need to get those results back very quickly. So I want to be able to solve that problem, and I can do that as an administrator of my report server by enabling something called caching. Now, the way caching works by default, and we'll talk about going beyond the defaults in a few moments, but by default, the way caching works is when Jill comes in, if I've enabled caching on this report, okay, so let's say caching is enabled for this discussion. Okay, if I've enabled caching on this report, when Jill comes in at 8 a.m., she's still going to have to wait, let's say, the 30 seconds that the report takes to run. Okay, so she's waiting 30 seconds. She clicks on the report, walks over, gets coffee, and comes back. When Jeff comes in at 8:30 and runs the report comes back in 1 second. He didn't have to wait at all, basically. So what's happening here? What happens with caching is the default settings for caching make it so that when Jill clicks on the report, she waits. She feels the pain of that report, the 30 seconds of waiting for that report. She feels the pain. But she's also creating a cache copy of the report for Jeff. So when Jeff comes in at 8:30, he clicks on the report. He doesn't have to wait at all because Jill actually pre-cached without even knowing she was doing it. She doesn't have to know anything about it. When she clicked on the report, she also created a cache copy of the report, and that cache copy of the report is stored in the report server tempdb. Okay? All right, so that way, the benefit that is given here to Jeff is not only does he not have to wait, but the report doesn't go back and query against the original database. So obviously there's a data source to this report, and when the report is run by Jill, it has to go back to the original data source, bring back the results, and that's why it's taking this 30 seconds. For Jeff, whenever he runs the report, it no longer has to go back to the original data source. That data source hasn't changed within the last 30 minutes anyways, let's just say for example. So it's going to return back a cache copy of the report, pull it back to Jeff, and he's able to get off and running without having to wait at all. Okay, so that's kind of the concept of caching reports. I'm trying to save time because there's no changing data that's occurring, or even if there is changing data, I want to be able to return back a cache copy so it's much faster. Now, the way that caching works by default is that a cache is good for 30 minutes. This is the default. 30 minutes, a cache will stay valid or stay live. After that 30 minutes, it expires itself. Again, these are default settings. I'll walk you through the settings to change the defaults here in a few moments. So 30 minutes of a cache. After that, it expires itself. Okay, after 30 minutes, it expires. Now, there's ways that you can actually control that. You can control and actually make it so that that cache doesn't expire for 4 hours. You can make it so that you automatically schedule when it should expire and when it should renew, that sort of thing. We're going to get into some of the details of that, but just understand the basic concept here being that I can enable caching on a report. One person feels the pain, and that once they feel that pain, it'll actually last and hold on to that cache for the next 30 minutes. So Jeff got a really fast report based on that. Now, the other complication to this is that a cache can only be stored per parameter combination. So what I mean by that is if I have 3 parameters in here, say I have start dates, end dates, and category as parameter values, if Jill picks a certain parameter combination and Jeff picks a different one, then he doesn't get to enjoy the cache that Jill made, that Jill created for her. So it's per parameter combination. If Jeff goes in and he changes the category from accessories to electronics, then all of a sudden that report has to go back to the original data source, back to the original database, and return back the results just like it was run for the first time. Okay? So keep that in mind, that it does matter the parameter combination. I'm going to demonstrate that to you here in a few moments. All right, so I mentioned that here on the slide that you're allowed 1 cache version for each combo of parameter values that you have. Okay? All right, so let's walk through enabling cache. I see we're getting a bunch of questions in here. I'll make sure that we kind of go through this demo and see if we can't answer a couple here. All right, so my first demonstration I have for you is a basic report here. All right, so you can see this report actually comes back pretty quickly, but that's fine. We're still going to kind of walk through an exercise here of how we can enable caching. And basically what this report is telling me is showing me sales for the last, sales now compared to 12 months ago. Okay, so the report itself is not really relevant, but one thing I will mention to you that you really should do and you should add to a report if you're doing things like caching or snapshots is you should really add in an execution time. You'll see I have an execution time here in the bottom. That's going to be very critical for your report because that tells your users when the data is good as of. Because remember, when you enable caching, it's going to keep that version of the report for the next 30 minutes. Okay? So if data has changed within the next 30 minutes, then they won't know that they're looking at bad data or old data. So really adding in an execution time when you're doing things like caching is critical. You need to do that. And I should really put some kind of label next to this saying, report ran as of this date and time kind of thing. Okay. So I have this report. Right now when I click on it, it returns back the results. It goes back to the original database and it returns back the results. What I'd like to do is instead of going back to the database every time, my database isn't changing but once a night because I have a data warehouse. I'm updating my data warehouse nightly, so I want to pull back data once from that data warehouse during the day and then reuse that same cache all throughout the day. So to do something like that, I need to enable caching, and I can do that by going to the properties of my report. So I'm going to go to my webinar example here. These are the properties of the report we were just looking at. And there's really several things that we care about in regards to caching. If we look over here in the properties section, we care about the cache refresh options, and we also care about processing options. Now real quickly, I'll mention as well in here, you'll notice that there's snapshot options and snapshot report history and things like that. You'll see some snapshot functionality here and there. Snapshots are nice as well. Their true intent is to be able to track historical copies of reports. They can also help with performance as well because, again, they're not having to go back to the original data source every time they return back data. But the intent of snapshots is more to be able to track a history of a report execution. So I may create a snapshot of end of month or end of quarter version of my reports. That way I can see exactly what my report looked like at that point in time. Okay, so snapshots are kind of different, although you do see some people use them for methods of performance tuning as well. All right, so there's a couple things we're going to look at. The first thing I'm going to show you guys is processing options, and then we'll come back to this refresh options in a moment. So underneath processing options, this is where you can define what happens when someone clicks on a report. Okay, so what I mean by that is when someone is looking at an interactive view of the report server, like we're looking at right here, or SharePoint. By the way, this does work in SharePoint if you're using SharePoint integration. But if I'm looking at this interactive view of my report server and I click on a report, what is going to happen? Is it going to go back to the original data source and pull back on-demand data? Or is it going to go to a cache copy of the report and pull back cache data? So processing options that we were looking at just a moment ago, processing options here underneath the properties of our report defines what happens when someone clicks on the report. Okay, you really have three options. Let me zoom in on this. You have on-demand mode. Okay, that's the first one here, and that's the default. On-demand meaning that it's going to go back to the original data source and pull back that new data every single time, even if the data hasn't changed. The second set of options here is for cache, or caching. So it's going to pull back a cache copy of your report. And then the last setting here is for snapshots. So again, this is if you're looking, if you want to render historical copies of your reports based on when someone clicks on the interactive view inside the report manager. Okay, so you can either do on-demand, caching, or snapshots. This is what happens when someone clicks on the report. On-demand, you guys already know how to do. That's what's been available to you throughout. It's the default setting. We're going to talk about now actually enabling caching. Okay, so the first option here that you see as far as caching goes is that you can cache a temporary copy of the report, and it expires after a set number of minutes. So if you remember, the default setting I talked about earlier was the default was that it will expire after every 30 minutes. Obviously here I can come in here and change this and say I want the default to be to expire after every 90 minutes because that's when my data warehouse load occurs. Every 90 minutes I reload my data warehouse, so I want to make sure that I pull in the latest data after 90 minutes. Okay? So this is a pretty arbitrary thing. It's not telling you when is it going to start, when is it going to end. It simply says every 90 minutes I want you to run, based 90 minutes from the point where I hit apply down here at the bottom. You could also schedule this. You'll see here that you can cache a temporary copy of your report, and that temporary copy of the report will expire based on a schedule. Okay, so your two options as far as caching here is I can expire my cache after 30 minutes or 90 minutes like I selected, or you can expire the cache based on a schedule that you enter. Okay, that's up to you. It's just what makes sense best for you is, do I want to expire it every 30 minutes or based on a schedule that I create? I'm just going to, for our demonstration purposes here, I'm going to say expire this after every 30 minutes because that's the default. Okay, and then I'm going to come down to the bottom and hit apply so we can see exactly what happens when we do report caching. So far, all I've done is I've turned on report cache. Okay, and I've turned it on so that when someone comes over to my report, okay, and someone clicks on my report, it's going to attempt to render based on a cache copy of the report. If there has never been a cache copy created, it will first create that cache copy of the report, which you'll see it's actually doing right now. It's created right now. When I clicked on that, not only did it try and render from a cache copy, which there was none, because I'd never turned it on before. When it saw that there was no cache copy of the report, it created one. So part of the process of rendering the report right there was creating a cache copy of my report. Okay, now notice the time. Pay close attention to the time here on the bottom. We're looking at today at 11:28 and 13 seconds. Okay, so that's when this report was run. That's my execution time. If I go to run this report a second time, you'll notice the time does not change. It's actually rendering based on that cache copy of the report. And that cache copy of the report was executed at this time. So for the next 30 minutes, if someone runs this report and clicks on it, it's going to return back the exact same results with that exact same time. Okay, that's part of the way caching works. It's going to keep this version of this report as the active one for the next 30 minutes. Now remember what I said earlier, cache copies of reports are only good for 30 minutes. So after 30 minutes, it will change and it'll actually render the report based off the data source a second time. The other thing about cache reports is that they're based on a parameter combination. So you'll notice that I have 3 parameters up here at the top. I have measure name, lag month, start date. If I change any one of those 3 parameters, then it will have to render the report again back from the original data source. Okay? So let's say, for example, I change the lag month here from 12 to 6 and hit view report. If I change that value, it then runs and executes my report again. You'll notice the time does change. We're looking at 11:29 and 59 seconds. Okay? And it went and returned back that data from the original data source and cached this new copy of the report. Now you can actually have an unlimited amount of cached copies of report. There's no limit to the number, but of course you are eating up some of your reports through TempDB the more and more you do this. Now, the neat thing about how caching works is if I come back up to that parameter, that lag month parameter, and I change it back to 12 and hit view report again, notice my time this time. It went back to that cached copy that we did earlier. So it's kind of like I went back in time here. It actually allowed me to pull back from a cached copy that had been used previously. Because again, it's caching copies of your report per parameter combination. So any change in the parameter combination will generate a new cache copy. Okay? And again, I can flip back to 6 months, and it'll still show 11:29 and 59 seconds. If I change anything else in here that causes a new cache copy, let's say I can change my measure here and hit view report, it's going to render that report as if it was new, and you'll notice the time here is at 11:31, which is the same as my system time here. Okay? So that's how caching works. Caching will allow you to store those temporary copies of the report inside a report server TempDB. Okay. Now I do see we have a bunch of questions there. I'm looking at the time. I want to make sure I get this. Let me get this next module in, or this next portion of the demonstration in, and I'll start to get some of those questions. All right, so you're probably asking yourself this. I want to be able to automate that. I don't want to have Jill, who comes in at 8 o'clock, to have to feel any pain of a 30-second wait in my report execution. I want that report to come back immediately. No one should have to wait for reports more than 3 seconds. So if I plan on implementing something like that to actually automate a refresh of my cache, I can do that from the properties of my report. So if I go to Manage My Report, and I come down here where it says Cache Refresh Options, okay? Underneath Cache Refresh Options, I can create what's called a new Cache Refresh Plan. And basically what this Cache Refresh Plan allows me to do is schedule a refresh. Now the downside of doing this, let me walk you through this real quickly. The downside of creating a Cache Refresh Plan is I have to know ahead of time what parameter values I want to cache. Because remember, whenever you're doing a cache of a report, it stores that cache based on the parameter combination. So of course, if I'm going to schedule a cache refresh plan, I need to know what parameters or what parameter values are being used. Now of course you can select the defaults here, or I can come and actually know what my users are using. And this kind of comes back to those monitoring reports we looked at earlier. Remember those monitoring reports I showed you when we started? Those can be used for implementing a cache refresh plan. I can see which parameter combination my users are using and how slow each of those parameters are when they're executed. That was all visible inside those monitoring reports we looked at earlier. And I can look at those reports and determine that these set of parameters are my heaviest used parameters and also my slowest. So I can come in, select, and create a cache refresh plan around the parameters that are slowest. Now creating the plan itself is pretty simple. You give it a description. So I'll call this webinar example. Tell it when you want it to run, so just create a schedule. So right now it's set to every morning or every Monday at 8 a.m., but of course I can come in here and configure a schedule. It looks very similar to any kind of scheduling tool you've probably dealt with before. And then I'll come down to the bottom and tell it which parameter values do I want to use. I can change my parameter values here that I want to cache. Any one of them, I can type them in for ones that have an empty text box, like my start date. And then when I'm happy with what I've selected for my parameters, I'll hit OK. Now what's going to happen, well that's pretty critical. So what this is telling me is that I need to have the SQL Server agent running to be able to create a cache refresh plan. And I'm actually kind of glad this popped up. And the reason this popped up is because all of reporting services scheduling activity is done through the SQL Server agent. So anywhere that you install the report server database, you must have a SQL Server agent enabled or turned on to be able to use it. So let me show you really briefly what the problem is here, because it's important. You may run into this. In my case, I have a SQL Server here that I just don't have the SQL Server agent running. And you can see here I can come over here and go ahead and start it. And by starting the SQL Server agent, it will allow reporting services to actually create scheduled activity on my SQL Server. Okay, so now with that SQL Server agent started, you should see it turn green here in a moment. There it goes, it turned green. Now with that started, I can create cache refresh plans. I could also create things like subscriptions or schedule snapshots. Any of that activity can now be created. And you'll see now that I've turned on my SQL Server agent, I have the ability here to see my refresh plan that I just created. Okay, so one quick question I just kind of saw out of the corner of my eye here is which version of reporting services are you using? I am using right now 2008 R2, but you could do this on 2012. You could do this on 2005 even. It's available at any version of reporting services. Okay. All right. So I've now enabled a cache refresh plan. So when I run this, or really when the schedule occurs, it's going to refresh my report cache automatically for me. And I can see that actually occurs. It creates a new SQL agent job for me if I wanted to go dig through all these nasty GUIDs. If you see a bunch of GUIDs on your SQL Server agent, it's likely because your reporting services server has created all these SQL agent jobs. And it's just based on scheduled activity that is occurring on your report server. Okay. All right, so that's one way to do refresh plans. Now, hopefully you saw the flaw with that. The flaw with this plan is that I have to know the parameter values ahead of time. The flaw with doing a cache refresh plan is I have to know what parameters I want to cache. Well, for me, I don't know what parameters I want to cache. I just know that I need to cache any possibility of what my users may do. If my user logs in, I want to be prepared to cache whatever report they're going to use, and whatever parameter I should say. I want to be able to prepare to be able to do any report parameter combination they may choose. So if that's the case, there is one other option for me. Okay, let me go back to my slides here for a moment. A little early, there we go. All right, so for automating cache creation, I'm going to do something called a null delivery provider, and this null delivery provider is part of DataDriven Subscriptions. Okay, DataDriven Subscriptions are going to allow me to create a scheduled activity, okay, that I populate all the properties of from a query. So I can basically write a query, and I can use the results of that query to automate a process, whether it is emailing a report or creating a file of a report, or in our case, I can actually write a query to pre-populate all the combinations of parameter values that my users may enter in. And that's done through a null delivery provider. It's part of a data-driven subscription. So basically what I would do is I'd write out a query ahead of time. In my case, I'm actually writing a report off of an analysis services database, so I would need to write an MDX query. But I would write that MDX query. It would return back really 3 columns for me. A column for my start date. Let me show you what this report looks like again, just to remind you. I would need to return back a column, 3 separate columns, for my measure name, for my start date, and then also for my lag month. And I want to get a row for every combination of values that my users may enter in. And again, the reason I'm doing this, the reason I'm writing this query, is so that I can pre-populate the cache. So it'll create a cache copy of the report for me for every combination that my users may enter in. Okay. Somebody made a good point in the chat there. Yes, data-driven subscriptions are only available with enterprise licensing. So this is an enterprise-only feature that I'm showing right now. All right, so to do a data-driven subscription, I would come over to the report properties again. I would come over to subscriptions, okay, and you'll see I have 2 options. First of all, I'll mention that if you don't have enterprise, you won't see new data-driven subscription as an option. The other thing I'll mention about data-driven subscriptions is that if you're going to do data-driven subscriptions, you have to have the credentials for your data source stored inside of the data source on the server. So what I mean by that is for my data source that I'm using on this report, which is stored underneath my data sources folder, let me show you this real quickly, this is important. For my data source on the report we're using right now, I need to have the credentials stored. Okay, so you can see that I have the credentials stored here. My username, really I should have a service account here, but the service account would have my username and password that can authenticate to my data source. And the reason the credentials have to be stored for data-driven subscriptions is because it's running based on scheduled activities. So if it's running based on a schedule and not someone actually logged in, then it has to have some kind of username and password that it can use to bring back the data from the data source. And that's why you'll see that anytime you want to do any kind of scheduled activity in reporting services that returns back data from a data source, the data source has to have the credentials stored in it to be able to do this. All right, so I have my credentials are stored. Now I can go over to my report again, and I can create a data-driven subscription. All right, so we'll go over to subscriptions, and I'll create a new data-driven subscription. I'm not going to go all the way through this, by the way, because we're running out of time, and I want to take questions, and I have one more thing to show you. Give the data-driven subscription a description, so pre-cache my report, something like that. I would select the report null delivery provider as my way of delivering my reports. Okay, so I'll select null delivery provider. Then I'll tell it which one of my data sources am I going to run my query against. Remember, I told you have to have a query that returns back the results that you want to pass into the report. So that report data source can either be one on the server already, or I can create one that's special for this subscription. I'm just going to tell it that I want to use a shared data source that's already on my server, and hit next. I'll then tell it where my data source is located. Mine is located on the AdventureWorks SSAS underneath my data source. Okay, I'll hit next. This last part here is, and really this is the last portion you have to configure services, so we need to have n values for the measure name, for the lag month, and for the start date. And with those three columns, can tell basis, and that way all of my factors. So Jill won't have to wait, Jeff won't have to wait. No matter who you are, no matter what you select, it'll return back the results automatically for you pre-cached. Oh, am I breaking up, Rachel?
Yeah, you were for me briefly.
Hopefully, is it better, Rachel?
Yeah, it's fine now.
Okay, someone else said I'm okay. All right, so that's for data-driven subscriptions. The whole point of that is to automate that process of the cache refresh options that we looked at earlier. So I want to refresh that so that it will automatically return back the results, and nobody has to wait, and there's no wait time for my users. Okay. The last thing I want to show you guys is proving out that your cache is working and that it's actually getting utilized. This can be done through the performance monitor. Now, I'm sure many of you guys have used perfmon before, or performance monitor. I'm going to talk about how it can be used with the reporting services a little bit here, because you'll be able to leverage perfmon for your cache refresh options here. Okay? So for the performance monitor, basically what we're trying to determine is our cache working properly? We've enabled caching. We want to make sure that it's actually being used as we intended it to. And the other thing that you can do with perfmon is it'll help you identify resource pressure that you may have on your server. Now there's three separate types of performance monitor objects that are available to you with reporting services. There's one that's a web services one, there's a Windows services one, and then there's just a report server service. And these different report performance objects do different things. The web service one is for interactive reporting. And let me write this on the whiteboard here because I see that it's not showing. Okay. So you have, I mentioned, three separate types of performance objects. You have the web service, or web services. You have the Windows service. And you have the report server services. Okay. Now these do three different things. There's a reason there's three separate ones, of course. The first one is for interactive reporting. Okay, so what is interactive reporting? It's me clicking on a report and it rendering the results. Okay. The Windows service is for scheduled activity. Okay. Anything that's occurring based on the schedule will show up underneath the Windows services report performance object. Okay. And then the last one here, this report server services, this is just general activity that's occurring on your report server. So how many people have logged in, how many failed logins you've had. It's just general report server details. Okay. Now for our demonstration here, I really care about interactive reporting because I keep clicking on reports and I keep running the report directly from the interactive mode. So if that's what I care about, I'm going to launch the report, the performance monitor, and turn on the web services performance object. And that way I can see exactly what's going on whenever someone clicks on the report. Okay, so let me walk you through how you would do this. I'm going to come to my Start menu on my machine here. You can see I have the performance monitor already open here, but in case you've never opened it before, you can go to the control panel here, and you'll find underneath Administrative Tools, you'll find the performance monitor. Okay, so if you're a DBA, you've probably done some activity with Performance Monitor before. If you're not, this may be new to you. All right, so I'm going to launch Performance Monitor. Okay. And you can see underneath the Performance Monitor right now, it's just giving me % of processor time that's being used up on my machine. So just some general information about my machine in general. This is actually a Windows tool. It's not something specific to SQL Server, but we can use it for monitoring stuff that's going on with SQL Server. So I'm going to turn off this CPU processor time thing here. I'm going to turn that off, and I'm going to add in some new performance counters that are specific to reporting services. Now to do that, I would come up to the top here, and you can select that you want to add in a new performance counter. And you get a big, long list because, again, this is more of a Windows tool that allows you to look into what's going on with SQL Server. but you get this big long list of all kinds of different performance objects that you can use. The one that we're going to look at is one called MSRS, and again, I'm using 2008. Someone asked that earlier. I am using 2008 R2 for this demonstration today. I want to look for MSRS 2008 R2 web service. Okay, and what this web service has in it is the interactive execution of my reports. Okay, so when someone clicks on a report from the report manager, it's going to show up under web service. If a report is scheduled to be returned back to someone's mailbox, then it would show up underneath the Windows service here. All right, so I'm going to open the web services, and I'm going to pick a counter. These are all performance counters that you see below here. This is just information that you can look at. So I could look at something like the total cache hits. I could look at something like the total cache misses. These are both really important. Okay, so I'm going to bring in total cache hits, and I'm going to add it. I'll hit add here. I'm also going to bring in total cache misses, and let's see what else would be interesting here. I'm just going to bring back total requests as well. Okay, so I see how many of my reports actually hit a cache copy of the report, how many of them missed, and then how many total requests I've had. I'll hit OK, and I can see all three of those. Really, there's four here still, but I can see all four of the counters that I added in visible here. Okay. Now, as I run different reports, we'll see different peaks and valleys of what is executing on my report server. Now, one thing I'll mention about the performance monitor, this does not allow me to dive into great detail and actually see specifically which reports were run. This is more of just some other tool that you have in your tool belt to be able to see what's going on your report server. All right, so as I run a report, if I run this report right here, for example, you'll notice the time here indicates that it did hit a cache copy of my report. So this should have been a cache copy of my report. If I go look at my performance objects, I will see that my red line did have a little upscale there, and my red line is represented by total cache hits. That tells me that I hit my cache copy of a report, which is good. That's what I intended to happen. Now, if I change the parameters at all, remember the parameter values indicate which cache copy it's going to hit. Let's say I change this to something I haven't done before. Maybe I tell it I want to change this to look 1 month back. Now it should go to a non-cache copy of my report. I can tell that based on the time here on the bottom. So it's 11:50:49 here. And if I go back to my performance monitor, I will see a little peak up on my green line, and my green line is represented by total cache miss. Okay, so total cache misses are indicated there. And again, the more I run the report, if I go back and say I want to run the report again, it should have another cache hit, and I should see another peak up in my red line, which I do here. So Performance Monitor here is just useful to make sure that your reports are actually doing what you anticipate they're doing. I could also kind of get that indication from just having my execution time on the bottom. So that execution time on the bottom was really helping me also determine that I had a report executed and it used cache. Unfortunately, again, by using this performance monitor, it doesn't necessarily give me to the great detail of which report was executed. It's more very high level of total number of cache hits and total number of cache misses. That's what we're really getting out of this here. So with the time we have left here, I know we're about 10 minutes left. I thought we'd make sense if I went through some questions here. So Rach, let's do that. Do you have some of them queued up, or let me look over here as well?
Sure, I do. So here's one.
By the way, yeah, go ahead. As you're doing that, I'll go ahead and put my contact information up.
Okay.
Go ahead.
All right, so does cache refresh settings still apply to the reports you've cached through the null delivery provider option?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that one more time? I missed the first part.
Does the cache refresh setting still apply to the reports you've cached through the null delivery provider?
Oh, okay. So if I've done both, I guess. If I've done the cache refresh plan and I've done the null delivery provider, does it allow me to do both, I guess is probably the question. Yeah, it does. So if I've done a cache refresh plan and I've done a null delivery provider, you can do both, and it will cache them separately. So it's not going to build. You're not going to be able to build cache on top of cache. If that may be what the real question is there.
Okay, and I think you already answered this, but in case anybody missed it, you were using 2008. Is that right?
Yeah, I showed this in 2008 R2, but it's available in any modern version of reporting services, even 2005. One thing I'll mention as well is it does work with SharePoint. So if you have SharePoint integration with your report server, you can do this from there as well. Just keep in mind if you have that, you're not using the report manager like I showed here. You're using SharePoint to be able to manage all that.
Okay. I can answer one of these questions. Yes, the webinar is viewable later. It has been recorded and it will be posted on our website by tomorrow. So please check back under our Learning Center and under past webinars. The next question is, what SQL would you put into DD subscriptions to pre-fill all options, and how long would it take to create all the reports?
Okay. So DD, I'm assuming, stands for Data-Driven Subscriptions. So he's asking, he or she is asking, what query, I guess, would I need to write there? So the query that I would need would basically just have to produce a list. And the list that it's producing is a list of values that would go into the parameter. Now, I told you in my example that I used an analysis services data source, but I don't necessarily have to write a query against analysis services. I could write a query against regular SQL Server database, write T-SQL, for example. And then by writing that T-SQL, as long as the results come back and can be entered into my report parameter values, then it doesn't matter what the data source is. Traditionally, you would, however, write a query against the same type of data source that your report is generated from. But as long as the parameter values can go into the parameters of the report, then it really doesn't matter.
Okay, great. The next question I have lined up is, for daily reports, should you cache or use snapshots for reports with no parameters?
Oh, okay, so did you say for daily reports?
Yes.
Okay. So with caching, my short answer would be you're probably going to do caching because snapshots you usually hold a limited number of snapshots. There's a default setting on your server with how many snapshots you can create. But it really depends on when you need the data refreshed. If you're not getting anything changed in your data but once a night, then you can kind of have some flexibility on what you choose. Snapshots would work, but keep in mind that snapshots are really intended for going back and looking at historical copies of a report. So if I need to go back and see the end of week version of the report or the end of day, if my intent there is to see what the daily version of a report is for the last 10 days, then snapshots may be a good answer. If I could care less about the history of my report executions, then probably snapshots are the way to go.
Okay, great. How long would it take to turn out hundreds, if not thousands, of combinations of parameters?
Yeah, that's a pretty variable question, I guess. It depends on what your query is. So how complex your query is, how many parameter values you have. In my case, I probably had a couple thousand different parameter values. So it's having to create thousands of report executions to store in my report server TempDB. Now, it's all done on a schedule. So again, first variable is it depends on what the data source is, the complexity of the query. But it's all done on a schedule, so it's not usually something that you're waiting around for. It's usually something that you put on a schedule to do overnight, and then that way when people come in the morning, it's already pre-cached and loaded for them. So short answer is it depends. Long answer, it also depends with several variables.
Okay. Can we do this report? Can we do this on the report T-SQL query, like giving parameter to null so that you can get all the records so that we can avoid the DD subscription?
Okay, I'm trying to think ahead. Can you repeat portions?
Yeah, it was quite a big one. Can we do this on the report T-SQL query, like giving parameters to null so you can get all the records so you can avoid the DD subscription?
Oh, okay, I see. So the question there is, can I write a query that maybe has null in it so it just returns back all the parameter combinations and I don't have to do the data-driven subscription? If the report values return back what you're expecting, or if the way that you run the report will return back all the values and that's what you're hoping to return back, then sure you can. But you're probably going to have to write a query that returns back all those different parameter combinations because you're basing it on what your users will select. If your users will change a parameter value to have null in it, then sure, you can do that. But if your end users are going to change a parameter value, to, like my example where I changed it to the number of months, then you need to be prepared for whatever they're going to select because the caching of the report is based on what the users are going to select from the interactive view.
Okay. I know we only have time for a couple more questions, so I'll try to pick some shorter ones. Would you be able to determine most used parameters for a report and use those for cache reports?
You sure can, yeah. So that was actually something we talked about earlier with the monitoring reports. With those monitoring reports, we could see, and actually I think I still have that up. With the monitoring reports, I could go find any one of my reports here. Let's see this Module 5 one, for example. I can see exactly how many executions I have for each of these parameters, and I could do a query against this report execution log database and return back just the parameters that my users are actually doing. So that's a great way of doing it. So that in case you're not sure what we're talking about here, the concept is rather than having a query against the data source, why don't I query against this report monitoring database that I talked about to start off the session? You sure could. If I could return back the values, and as long as those values can be passed into the report, then I could just do caching on values that my users are actually selecting instead of every parameter combination that there is. So I could look at my monitoring database, find the combinations that my users are actually doing, and cache on that instead of every possible value.
Okay, great. So this question is about management report download from Code Project website. Do you think there will be many changes to do to get it working in SQL 2012?
No, there really isn't. I had to upgrade. The biggest change will be on the SSIS side. So I mentioned there's an SSIS package that comes with it to load the monitoring database. If you're not aware, there was some significant changes with SSIS from 2008 to 2012. So there's some updates you have to do to it there, but outside of that, there's very minimal changes. Though on the reporting services side, you'd have to change almost nothing. It's more on the SSIS side, and that's just because of the way SSIS has changed from each of the versions.
Okay, awesome. And I think we only have time for about one more question. So it is, do you have to pull internal parameters in query or just user promoted parameters?
Okay, so I see that's the last one there. Do you have to pull...
Prompted parameters.
You have to pull internal parameters in query or just... You have to do kind of both. If you have a default setting, so if there's a parameter that's internal and it's defaulted to some value, or maybe it's passed in from something else, if it's expecting a value, then you have to account for that whenever you're doing the query for it. So if it's expecting to have some kind of value placed into it, you could either write it in the query, or you can hard code it if it's always the same value, or if you're expecting a certain value, you can do that in the DataDriven subscription as well. It'll let you either hard code it or base it off of a query.